Here is everything you need to know about carbs in order to grow muscle. So what is carbs? Carbs is a macronutrient from fats, carbs, and protein, and its primary role is to provide us with energy. Carbs is our first and primary source of energy and is mainly used for anaerobic movements. This includes sprints, bursts, Olympic lifting, powerlifting, and even bodybuilding, because we're not using oxygen while performing these movements. Carbohydrates, polymers, or molecular structures are saccharides. Carbohydrates have many forms of polymers. The first one comes in natural whole food, like disaccharides. Disaccharides comes in three forms: sucrose like fruits and candy, lactose like milk and dairy, and lastly maltose like bread, rice, and pasta. When we consume a disaccharide, we begin at the mouth, then the esophagus, then to the stomach, and then it reaches to the small intestine. Once they reach to the small intestine, disaccharides are broken down even further to monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are the simplest form of carbohydrates that there is. And this stuff is like fructose, galactose, and glucose. We'll be focusing more on glucose since glucose is our main source of energy. Once a monosaccharide is inside the small intestine, a sodium receptor will bind onto glucose and then they both will make their way into the bloodstream. So this means that it is important to not cut sodium because sodium acts like a train for the carbohydrate so it can reach the bloodstream. Once glucose arrives to the bloodstream, our pancreas will secrete a hormone called insulin, and insulin is the receptor that will drive glucose to be stored in the liver or in the muscle as glycogen, which is another word for a bank of carbs, also another polymer for carbohydrates. So carbs are stored as glycogen. So insulin is basically another train for the carbohydrates from the bloodstream to its final destination, muscle or liver glycogen. Glycogen is also another polymer for carbohydrates. Just like how protein are cycling through the amino acid pool each time, and fats are stored in the adipose fat tissue, carbs are stored as glycogen. It is also important to know that if insulin is not secreted when glucose is present in the bloodstream, then this is type 1 diabetes. On the other side, if insulin is secreted but does not bind with carbs, then this is type 2 diabetes because it doesn't interact with carbohydrates. This is why diabetics either inject insulin or avoid carbs. Glucose in the liver will be used for systematic regulations in the body, like releasing glucose to balance out blood glucose levels, but glucose in the muscles can only be released through the stimulation of anaerobic exercise of that certain muscle. For instance, doing squats will utilize carbohydrates in the leg muscles and not anywhere else, only the leg muscles. It is also good to know that when our glycogen reserves are full, meaning where our carb bank is just full of carbohydrates, then the rest of the carbs that is still present in the bloodstream will simply be turned into fats. And that process right there is called de novo lipogenesis, when carbs get turned into fats. We heard this glycemic index, and it's very carbohydrate related. What is it and what does it do? By definition, the glycemic index is a system that ranks a food on a scale from 1 to 100 based on their effect on blood sugar levels. So for example, white bread has a glycemic index value of 70. That's relatively high because white bread raises blood glucose level a lot. On the other side, whole grain bread only has a glycemic index value of 40 because it does not raise blood glucose levels as much as the white bread. Foods that are high in the glycemic index are also very fast digesting. That means that it's very fastly absorbed into the body, while foods that are lower in the glycemic index are digested a lot slower. This means that meal timing using the glycemic index can affect your performance and how you use it. So when you wake up, that is why some people prefer to eat oatmeal, because it's very slow digesting due to its very low glycemic index value. So it's going to keep them fuller throughout the day. Also, before a workout, it might even be ideal to eat a very high glycemic index valued carbohydrate like white rice or white bread. Even after a workout, when your body is primed to absorbing carbohydrates, some people prefer to drink a fast digesting carbohydrate like Gatorade after a workout because they replenish glycogen very fast. So how much carbohydrates do we need then? It is recommended to eat around 45% to 65% of your calories from carbohydrates. But this is just all preference. Everybody's carbohydrate intake is different. This all personally depends on the person's amount of muscle and physical activity. For example, Mr. 4-time Olympia Jay Cutler ate about 1,000 grams of carbohydrates each day in order to maintain his muscle and size, while someone like me probably only needs around 200 instead. Some carbohydrates, however, does not get fully digested, like fiber. So it is very important to understand that if a carbohydrate source has dietary fiber, then you wouldn't really count that towards your carbohydrate intake because it simply does not get digested. For instance, if a piece of bread has 20 grams of carbohydrates, but 4 of those grams are fiber, then that means that there's only 16 grams of total net carbs in that piece of bread. It's also very ideal to pick fibrous carbohydrates for your carb intake. There are 2 types of fiber. The first one is soluble fiber, and this type of fiber will regulate blood sugar levels and protect against heart disease by lowering bad cholesterol. The second type of fiber is insoluble fiber, and this type of fiber will keep you from constipation because it helps your bowel movements. So what's going to happen if we don't have carbohydrates inside our body? Well, then we're going to go to our other 2 macros, fats and protein. We're going to turn fats into ketones through a process called ketosis, and we're going to turn protein into carbohydrates through a process called gluconeogenesis. So what does this mean? This actually means that carbohydrates are not necessary. This means humans can continue without carbs since our body can tap into our other macronutrients, protein and fats, for the use of energy. Although carbohydrates is unnecessary for human life, it is not ideal for people involving fitness to do that because we don't want protein and fats to break down for energy when we're exercising, unless the individual is on the keto diet, meaning eating more fats than usual to support the caloric intake, or simply by eating more protein than usual. As mentioned earlier, carbs are our preferred source for anaerobic movements, and anaerobic stands for without oxygen, and carbs does not use oxygen. Carbs is also the regulator of the fat-burning hormones, insulin and leptin. This is why metabolism is increased after a cheat day because of the increased intake of carbohydrates. It then would make sense to add a high carb day or refeed day once in a while dieting to give your metabolism a boost to increase performance from restoration of glycogen and insulin levels and simply for satisfaction and psychological reasons. Carbohydrates also hold water. Roughly 1 gram of carbohydrates holds about 2 to 3 grams of water. So this means by eating carbs and filling up glycogen may make one person look bigger, but the majority of it is simply from water. Vice versa, if a person cuts down on carbohydrates and loses about 5 pounds in a couple of days, then it's mostly just water waste that's lost. It is also important to know that when eating low-carb diets like the ketogenic diet, it may make one look smaller and flatter simply because there's no carbohydrates in the muscle glycogen. Have that person on a ketogenic diet carb back up by eating carbs, they'll look hard as a rock again, simply because of the restoration of glycogen. To wrap this video up, carbohydrates are an important macro because they are the primary source of energy and the essential energy for anaerobics. They can be turned into a fat if glycogen storage is full. They are the regulator of insulin and leptin, and carbohydrates can determine performance, and let's not forget the person's appearance because of their current condition of glycogen. And that is everything you need to know about carbohydrates in order to grow muscle. And why should you believe me? Well, because I am aesthetic. So if you don't believe me, you'll never know anything about carbs.